Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the IISS. My name is Dana Allen. I'm a senior fellow and editor of the IISS journal Survival. The decision to be taken by British voters in less than 2 weeks cuts across questions of identity, economy, politics, constitutional order, international order, diplomacy, military strategy, national security, and the list goes on. These are all dimensions of what we mean by the word strategic. And it's perhaps understandable that the debate in Britain is focused on narrowly British questions, but it's fairly obvious that there will be consequences for Europe writ large and for the world coming out of this decision. So we took it upon ourselves to assemble a really stellar team of intellects, British, French, American, to write about the strategic implications of Brexit in the current issue of Survival. 3 of them are on this panel. They are well known, and I'll make their introductions very brief. Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Professor Francois Heisberg is Special Advisor to the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy and Chairman of the IISS. And Nigel Inkster, who served for 31 years in the British Secret Intelligence Service, is Director of Future Conflict and Cybersecurity here at the IISS. There are 2 additional contributors to the package of articles on Britain and Europe in this current issue. Dr. Matthew Harries, IISS Research Fellow and Managing Editor of Survival, is sitting someplace in the front row. There he is, and I might bring him into the discussion later. And Professor Eric Jones, my colleague at the SAIS Europe Bologna Center of Johns Hopkins University, is one of the leading American experts on European political economy. And he wrote a piece in this package, as well as a very, very interesting and thoughtful blog post on the current IISS homepage. Before we start, let me say that I considered and then decided against asking for a moment of silence at this point. There are, of course, a lot of tragedies in the world on a daily basis, and for many reasons we are more aware of them than ever. The Orlando horror yesterday was the largest mass shooting in American history, which is saying something. And though we will go straight to the business at hand, I'll just observe that it seems to me to raise principles and imperatives of transatlantic as well as European solidarity that might inform our discussion. I'll go in alphabetical order, starting with Professor Freedman to my right, up to 15 minutes each. Less is welcome, but not necessary. And then we'll have a good 45 minutes for discussion.
Dana, thanks very much indeed. I used, once upon a time, when I used to write columns for newspapers, to have a sort of standard article after every shocking and surprising event that would start, in retrospect, it was inevitable, and conclude, whatever else one can say, things will never be the same again. And we can use that article in 10 days' time, although I'm not quite sure what will turn out to be inevitable, and I'm not quite sure how things will never quite be the same again, but they won't. Because this debate and this occasion has changed things, will leave the UK a different place than it was before, and will leave Europe, I think, in some ways a different place than it was before. And part of our challenge, I think, is to work out in what ways. And obviously this depends considerably on how the vote goes, but it also, I think, the campaign already tells us something about where we are. And let me start with that. If Britain stays in the EU, this will not be because of love or sentiment, this will be because of a hard-headed, pragmatic calculation of interest by voters. Basically, they will decide that they will be worse off if they leave, and better off if they stay, or at least more or less as they are. If they decide to leave, it will probably be largely because of concerns about immigration and in some cases because of notions of sovereignty. But what it won't be will be, if we stay, will be because of a vision of a future Europe. As one who's old enough to remember not only the last referendum, but the debates going into joining what was then the common market, it's important to recall that at that time, that vision was important. That someone like Edward Heath, that wartime generation, cared about the notion of European solidarity and unity in a way that I think is actually rather taken for granted now. It may be one of the successes of the EU that we don't talk about it, the ideas that the European Union has a role, or has had a role, in preventing yet another in the sequences of European wars. But it did. And the fact that we take it together, we don't even think about that or mock the idea of scaremongering, may be one of its achievements. But it's not part of the current debate. That vision is, does not inspire people and will not be getting people out to vote. Although the claims of solidarity and shared endeavour can still be made, but it's not what will motivate people. We're talking about something that is much more mundane. Secondly, we're in this situation obviously in part because of British politics and particular calculations by British political leaders, but we're also in this situation because of problems within the EU itself. It is not the easiest organisation to defend. It is suffering from major dysfunctions at the moment, oddly dysfunctions in which Britain is in some respects separate with the Eurozone, with Schengen, but nonetheless they affect its reputation and the sense of risk about being associated with the EU. Now, equally it's the case, as we've already seen during the Eurozone crisis of the past few years, if things go badly wrong in that direction, whether we're in or out, we're affected by it. And arguably, if we're out, we have less influence over controlling some of the consequences. But part of the difficulty we're in at the moment is because Europe overreached. It tried to go too far and tried to do too much. And that has put us in a position where the promise of the past no longer seems quite so exciting, and we're trying to cope with the consequences of overreaching. Now, one area of that is in the defence and security side. And that's obviously what we're supposed to be talking about most. Let me just, before I look at that a bit more closely, let me just say one thing about one of the problems with the debate that we're having. One of the difficulties, it's evident, is how little people understand how the EU works, how decisions get made. Very good examples of this are the current scares on the EU army or Turkey. And if you say there's a veto, say, that doesn't make any difference, the Germans will, etc., etc. The idea that there is politics within the European Council of Ministers seems to have escaped a lot of people. The idea that there are other people who share our positions is ignored or dismissed. There's a lot to be discussed and argued about in the European Council of Ministers. Sadly, because perhaps we haven't been engaging as much in the Council as we should have been in recent years, that sense of initiative, politics, key decisions being taken about the direction of Europe rather than just being some monolith pushing forward inexorably towards the superstate, some of that has sadly been lost. So there is politics in this, and it is a politics that we can join and influence. Obviously, if we've decided not to get involved, we can't. So let me look then at this question of defence and security. First, it's again, going back, it's important to keep in mind that one of the reasons why there was such a push to join the common market as it was, that began just a few years after the original six had come together was an awareness, A, that economic performance was better there than it was in the UK, but also that we were struggling to cope as an independent power. The idea that Britain somehow had a moment of greatness before we handed over sovereignty to the European Union is those who forget the various humiliations of the 1950s and 60s, from Suez to Rhodesia, from the withdrawal from east of Suez because we couldn't afford it anymore, never mind the 3-day week in the IMF. And so the IMF came afterwards, but before we'd fully got the benefit of being part of the common market. We joined the common market because of a sense of decline, because a sense that we could no longer cope as well now as we had been able to do in the past. And it, to some extent, again, our ability to arrest that sense of decline, to recover some of our international standing and our economic performance, is one of the benefits of our membership, but somehow, again, taken for granted. But it was never part of that we should sacrifice our other major institutional connection in Europe, NATO, to the EU. The idea of a European defence and security force was always around. Tindemann's report and all of that. The idea that we should detach ourselves from dependence upon the United States was obviously a key part of the Gaullist philosophy and legacy, but it was never part of our deal. The reason that we started to take it seriously, and we go back to Saint Malo in the late 90s now, was not because we wanted to escape from American influence and dependence, was because of concern that the United States could not be relied on certain issues within Europe indefinitely, and that we needed, it was a hedge. Unfortunately, once that Blair made that move with Chirac at Saint Malo in '98, we got into a rather ludicrous theological argument about NATO versus the EU and how relations between the two should be organised, despite the extraordinarily overlapping membership of the two organisations. And again, this seems to me to be an example of the tendency to overreach and set agendas that have very little relevance to the actual problems that were being faced. I think we're over that by and large now, and that that we've now a number of tasks have been identified that make reasonable sense for Europeans to do together, in which the United States and NATO would probably have no interest. We also have come to realise the leverage that the trading relationships give, and I think they have been used effectively, certainly with regard to Iran and to a degree with regard to Russia over Ukraine. So there are things that we can now do in our defence and foreign policy that we could not do so well outside the EU, but they're not necessarily decisive or transformational. But my final point on this is to keep in mind that original inspiration, that the idea that as the European Union goes through its ructions and difficulties, the transatlantic relationship moves on as smoothly in the future as it has in the past, seems to me to some extent over hopeful. Whether or not Mr. Trump becomes president, which I still think is highly unlikely, it warns of problems in Atlantic relationships as well as European relationships. And therefore, the challenge for a country like Britain is that we may find ourselves, if we leave the EU, with fewer options for our international arrangements than is assumed in the current debate. Final point is that Britain has always been a joiner rather than a leaver. Most of the major international organisations at work at the moment. We had a hand in founding and managed to secure a seat on the executive. The UN, NATO, major financial organisations. And actually the skill of the British Foreign Office and successive governments has been making multinational organisations work quite well for us. It's one of the things that we've done well. Now, it's different with the EU because we joined late and its culture and much of its structures were already set. And we felt uncomfortable in many ways. The compromises were difficult and we didn't necessarily feel, unlike the others, that we had at least one hand on the driving wheel. So it is different, and for that reason the relationship has never been so comfortable. But nonetheless, we shouldn't assume that we have got, as a country, the skills and the ability to run these things, to run our own trade and defence, our own trade and foreign policy without reference to the EU, as well as we think we should. It would be an enormous drain on our government machine to try to spend the next few years replicating many of the advantageous arrangements we have, for example, on the trading side. It's an enormous task which should not be trivialized. So my personal view is that yes, we should stay. Yes, we should try to make it work, but we should realize that we are trying to work within an organization that is in serious difficulty. And the challenge, once we've got over this debate, if we get over it in the way I would hope, is to find ways by which Britain, having been absent from many of the key debates on the future of the European Union, can actually find a way to insert itself back into them. Thank you.
Francois, thank you very much. Sorry, Laurie. Francois, thank you as well.
Oh, I already finished. Thank you very much. Well, the question which was put to me by Matthew Harris was, what would be the security effects of a Brexit? That is, I was not being asked whether a Brexit would be a good or a bad idea, and I wasn't asked what would be the probabilities thereof, and I wasn't asked what would be the consequences of remaining. Because as Laurie put it, things are never going to be the same again, but that cuts actually both ways. That is, the day after the referendum, whatever the outcome of the referendum, things are not the same as before. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So I was essentially told you have to take Brexit as a given. So what follows is not a wish list, I obviously underscore that, nor is it an indication of probability. That's simply the job I was supposed to do. And here you have a bit of a paradox. That is, the first order effects in the security sphere of a Brexit would be comparatively mild, the first order effects. And conversely, the second order effects could be quite severe. And that, of course, deserves some explanation. So the first order effects, what are we talking about? 24th of June, Britain is seen as having voted to opt out of the EU entirely, and the machinery of some form of renegotiation is put into play, pending at some unknown stage a vote in Parliament. Since my understanding as a benighted foreigner is that actually it's Parliament which is going to decide what to do with the outcome of the referendum. In the security sphere, nothing much actually changes on the face of it. CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy, has been in the doldrums for the last 5-6 years, essentially since the great financial crisis broke out and forced the EU to devote most of its energies to inward-looking stuff. CSDP doesn't amount to terribly much, a bit of successful anti-piracy in the Gulf of Aden, a few missions here and there in Africa, but pretty small beer when compared, when set against the size, the importance, the intrinsic weight of the members of the European Union taken as a collective. The UK has removed itself from the bulk of CSDP in the run-up to the operations in Iraq in 2003. You pulled out most of your soldiers from the Balkans, and you've never really come back. Yes, you always have some well-placed assets in human terms. You always have high-ranking military in key CSDP operations, and you also have enough people to do a bit of intel. But you're not a big player. You are not a big player, and you're not going to be a big player since you're out. But it doesn't make much of a difference. Secondly, you are not part of Schengen. You're not part of the European Union when it comes to the outside borders of the European Union. You are outside of the outside borders of the European Union. I flew in yesterday from Berlin, and I really was struck about how it resembled arriving from the United States of America. Traveling even in these terrorism-ridden days, migration-preoccupied days, flying from Paris to Berlin or Berlin to Paris is much more like flying from London to Glasgow than from Berlin to London. And you're not part of that. And therefore, the impact, and here I tread on some of Nigel's turf, your counter-terrorism relationship with the EU is not going to be hit as badly as if you were in Schengen and then decided to remove yourself as part of removing yourself from the EU. I would add that this would not in itself be a necessity, since you have non-EU countries which are members of Schengen, folks like Norway or Iceland. People who are thinking about the Norway future for the UK should actually look at some of the EU stuff of which Norway is a member, and which the UK has strenuously kept away from, like Schengen. So you're not part of that. You have your major security and defense relationships within NATO as a multilateral body. That's not going to disappear. You have your relationship with the US bilaterally and in the Five Eyes framework. I suspect that that is not going to disappear either. Lancaster House with France, signed about some 6 years ago, was strenuously emphasized by the British at the time as a bilateral operation, not one to be connected in any size, shape or form with the EU's endeavors towards a common security and defense policy. And the French will continue to have good reasons to want to maintain the Lancaster House format. It is a very good treaty. And it corresponds to an ever more natural industrial convergence of interests. I say ever more natural in the sense that for reasons which relate to changes taking place in German politics, French defense industry has more reasons than before to emphasize its relations with the British defense industry than it used to. And in the nuclear arena, the French have every reason to want to continue to help Britain remain a nuclear power and to have Britain help us remain a nuclear power, hence the 50 When I look at this, there is little scope for Operation Fear, but there is also very little scope for Operation Hope when it comes to the first order consequences. Things get much more hairy when you're talking about second order. what happens on the continent as a result of Brexit and the knock-on effects that has for the UK. Well, the first one is the enormous encouragement Brexit will give to the, not the unleashing, because that has already begun, but to the development of the forces of what I call in French souverainisme, but you don't need to translate that to understand what it means. Those forces, generally on the populist right, but also quite often on the populist left as well, which are essentially in the Eurosceptic, if not in the Europhobic camp. Will there be an exit after a Brexit? I don't know, but chances are that you would have a referendum in the Netherlands about membership of the European Union. The Netherlands was one of the founding states of the European integration process some 60 years ago. And the chances of it passing under those circumstances would not be negligible. The forces of populism are, of course, rife in France, and they are rife in Italy as well. These forces will all develop very substantially as a result of Brexit. And having a collapsing, disintegrating European Union would have security implications for the United Kingdom. A strong Europe with strong external borders and seriously good domestic intra-EU management of refugee issues or terrorism would be a rather different proposition from one in which you essentially would have no European Union, and where each country would higgledy-piggledy try to manage these big issues completely on its own. And of course, there are some differences in capabilities between Germany and Belgium, France and Austria, and so on. The waves crashing in from the Middle East and from the Russian East would arrive stronger, probably more frequently, towards the shores of Britain than is the case today. First problem. Second problem, and this is one of which the Germans are particularly attuned to and sensitive of, and quite rightly so. And here I would want to see my British friends to take a hard look at the issue of the Spiegel, which came out in English a couple of days ago, saying that the Germans wanted to see Britain in. It's not that you will learn tremendously much about the substance of the issues, and not with this audience, but it is the assumption made by the Spiegel that Germany would be confronted with something it really doesn't want, and that is to be thrust into a leadership role for which it has no appetite, and for which nobody around Germany is waiting for with bated breath. Germany would once again become too small for the world and too big for Europe. To use the Kissingerian language. I say Kissingerian because I've never been able to pin down where that form of words actually came from. Anybody who can help me there, I'm quite welcome. You'll be quite welcome. What would a Europe, a continent, a continental system, a dysfunctional continental system in which you would have pro and anti-German coalitions? Well, it's not the Third World War. The over-egging one has in the Remain debate here in the UK about the Third World War sort of breaking out because you leave the European Union. I do not take that. But I do take the notion that if you have a dysfunctional continental system, great opportunities will arise for the exploitation of those dysfunctions by unfriendly outsiders, like our friends in Moscow or some of our friends in the Middle East. Forces of souverainism, but also strangely enough, but this I take less seriously, and I put in my own grain of salt, and you probably want to add a few pounds of salt to it as well, and that is the force of federalism. I have to mention it because there is brave talk on occasion on the continent about, if the Brits leave, we will finally be able to build the Europe of our dreams, my dear. Nous sommes enfin seuls. We are at last alone without these people who have never wanted to be part of our beautiful family. And the notion is that somehow France and Germany and others would build up a new federalist Jerusalem. I don't believe it'll happen. We can leave that for discussion as to why I think it won't happen. If it does, this would not necessarily be a bad thing for the UK, because at least you would have a strong system in that case, which would help prevent the waves from the south and the east from crashing on your own shores. But of course, it would be a rather different Europe than the very liberal, open Europe which the British have tended to want to promote as part of their own vision, when they used to have a vision of the European integration process some years ago. And of course, the third second order problem is separatism. Separatism on the continent, well, yes, maybe Catalonia, maybe the Belgians, could be encouraged if you had Brexit. I have trouble taking that too seriously, not because the case couldn't be made that there would be better conditions for that happening after Brexit than before, but simply because the intrinsic probability of, for example, Catalonia finding a 50% plus situation, or the Basque country finding 50% plus situation to create independence, somehow I don't think you have a conjunction of circumstances which is nearly as favorable as the one which have arisen between Scotland and Britain. No, it's separatism within the Leave United Kingdom which worry me as a European. Some people tell me, the conditions for Scotland going for independence are not economically extraordinary, and that therefore, if Britain votes for leave, the independence issue will not be reopened. I don't believe that as a foreigner, but then that is simply a demonstration of my ignorance of the way things happen in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Dundee or whatever. I think the Scots would reopen. The SNP would reopen the issue, because it would have no choice than to reopen the issue, if only because it wants to remain in the European Union, and England in a leave referendum would not. And the scenario in which leave happens because England wants it to happen, but not Scotland or Northern Ireland, sounds to me like a pretty horrible recipe for the future of the kingdom remaining united. And that, of course, for us has implications. Ones which Britain may care about, or rump UK may care about or not, but once again, they would have implications for us. France and Britain today, I think, are quite secure in their position as permanent members of the Security Council. And I think also in both cases, in terms of defense, their positioning as nuclear powers is also reasonably secure. If it boils down to England, or England and Wales, what happens in the Security Council? And Russia remained the successor state to the Soviet Union because the West wanted that to happen in 1989, 1991. Would the rest of the world be terribly interested in making sure that England would be the successor country to the United Kingdom as the holder of the seat in the UN Security Council? I don't know, but I suspect that there wouldn't be very much energy in the defense of that position, except from the French, because it would be obviously in our interest not to see that status quo being upset. And as for the nuclear account, well, we have the Lancaster House agreements, but would a rump UK be in a position to honour its share of the agreements? No nuclear base in Scotland, or a base which would be on sufferance like the, what were they called, the bases in the Free Republic between 1921 and 1938, Queenstown and so on, which you eventually gave back to Ayr. This is not the sort of thing which makes people in Paris dream, beautiful dreams. And of course, if we are cut back, if we are cut down to size, because the British will have cut themselves down to below size, that makes the continental system even less able to influence security policy positively vis-à-vis the threats and the risks from the east and from the south. So these are quite, when you take them seriatim, and the second order consequences could actually be quite severe. Certainly for us, and I think quite probably for the British as well. Last point, I said I was not asked to discuss a Remain scenario, but as a foreigner, I will note that if the outcome is a narrow outcome, 51-49 in favor of Remain, my fear is that you will have massive instability in the Tory party, because this outcome will have been secured essentially by the SNP and to some extent by Labour and the Lib Dems. Maybe this once again may reflect my ignorance of political processes here, but I suspect this would not be a United Kingdom with which great things could be built over the following years. And when and I hear David Cameron say, as he did yesterday, Britain's authority will rise after an in-vote. We are not going to thank Mr. Cameron for having made us run a near-death experience. We will be relieved not to be dead. But we will not consider that Britain's authority will have risen as a consequence of having to do this bungee jump without a rope. No. And of course, we also have the long-term uncertainty. If the European Union decides that it is necessary to engage in more integrative measures, when will the next referendum in the UK happen? So it's not a very pleasant, even the Remain situation, unless it's a very clear-cut big Remain, would be pretty difficult. And for me, the worst Remain scenario, but I'm told that constitutionally it would not actually be a problem, although politically I doubt it, and that is one in which the UK votes to remain, like maybe 50.5%, and England votes to leave at 49.5, to leave 51%. The balance being represented by Scotland and Northern Ireland. Doesn't look very pretty, it doesn't sound too good. But I'll stop there because I don't want to spoil your day. Thank you.
And last but not least, Nigel Inkster.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dana. Good morning, everybody. I was asked in the article I wrote for Survival to focus very much on areas which people delude themselves I know something about, in particular the intelligence, counter-terrorism and security consequences of Brexit, and I will address some of that. But before I do that, I'd just like to make one or two broader observations which to some extent replicate, but I hope embellish what former speakers say. And of course, as the clock towards the referendum has ticked down, we've seen a discussion between Remainers and Brexiters that has become at once more heated and essentially more trivialized. We hear arguments that old age pensioners will be better or worse off, that the NHS will have more or less money, property prices will rise or fall depending on whether we stay or leave. And the nearest the debate has ever really come to being strategic is in terms of issues of border security and immigration control, though even there, very little that has been spelt out about the realities, and the strength of opinion, as with so much else, has been inversely proportionate to the availability of actual facts. But I think as the campaign has gone on, it has been possible to discern signs of something more profound underlying all the trivia. A sense that this is much more than about a country that, because of its very different historical experiences, has never felt the same visceral commitment as many other European countries to the European project, and has always been more ambivalent and transactional in its relationships with Europe. More a sense that the tectonic plates of the geostrategic order with which we've long been familiar are starting to shift and give way to something else. A perception that Brexit may be more than just a blip to be followed by business as usual, that it might actually be the first skein to come loose in a kind of wider strategic unraveling of uncertain duration with consequences that are hard to predict, and is a part of a sort of wider manifestation of a world in which the order we've come to take for granted and the values that we've tended to assume as holding good universally increasingly come under challenge. I would submit, for example, that in today's world, if we tried to get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the United Nations today, we probably wouldn't succeed. And that, I think, is quite significant, given that certainly the UK and Europe generally, a major plank of both these entities' diplomacy is to preserve and promote the values that are underpinned by that declaration. I think we're not going to obviously come up with an answer to this in our discussions today, but I also think we need to bear in mind that what we're seeing happening may actually be part of something deeper rooted in the human psyche, something more atavistic about ourselves as a species. And Europe, as we know it, was born of crisis, major existential crisis. Brexit is clearly not driven by any similar sense of existential crisis. In many ways, if you look at the United Kingdom in terms of security, well-being, prosperity, etc., we, to paraphrase Harold Macmillan, really have never had it so good. All the security problems that we worry about, keep us awake at night, pale into insignificance compared with World War II, with the Cold War. And most of them are manageable and in some cases even soluble with adequate political will. But if anything, what drives Brexit seems to be more an absence of perception of strategic threat. And it kind of reminds me, I'm on tenuous ground here because I know there's a very good Greek speaker in the audience, of one of my favourite poems by the Alexandrine Greek poet Constantine Gaddafi, Waiting for the Barbarians, Perimenondas tus barbarus, in which Gaddafi paints a picture of a city, Rome, Byzantium, he doesn't make it clear, in which all normal activity has kind of come to a halt because everybody thinks the barbarians are coming. And then at the end of the day, it turns out that they're not coming and they didn't even exist in the first place. And Gaddafi, in this wonderful, detached, ironic final couplet, says, Ketora titha kanume choris barbarus, I anthropi avti isan mea capialisis. And now, what will become of us, now that we no longer have the barbarians? They offered us a solution of a kind. And it seems that maybe mankind simply needs barbarians to come into our existence from time to time, because there is only so much normality and banality that we can actually cope with. Turning to the area that I'm supposed to actually know something about, the issues of security in terms of intelligence, counterterrorism, etc. I found it a very interesting exercise writing this article. I don't know how many of you noticed that on Saturday the Times contained an op-ed by my former colleague and boss, Sir John Scarlett, in which he made the point, rather more publicly than I did in my own survival article, that at the time of the negotiation of the Lisbon Treaty, the British intelligence community had lobbied hard and successfully for explicit language to be included in the Lisbon Treaty, stating that national security should remain solely the preserve of nation states. Those are not the exact words, but more or less. And this was an initiative that actually enjoyed significant support from other major European intelligence services, but they did not have the same leverage with their foreign ministry that the British intelligence community did. So it was very much up to us to deliver the outcome that was there. And I speak with feeling on this because I was the one who spent a lot of my time engaging in rather bruising negotiations with our own Foreign Office negotiators to ensure that this language was included. So institutionally, I think we can say that I come from a constituency that is very much not a federalizing force within the EU. And I think the reality is that efforts by federalizers to create Europe-wide intelligence and security structures are to some extent taking place. There has been some degree of what is termed in Brussels competency creep. But the reality is that any federal institutions of this kind would make no sense and would be completely dysfunctional unless there was a European government, a federal government. There is no point in having an intelligence or security organization, and it serves no purpose unless it is there to service the requirements and meet the needs of a government institution. So efforts to build up a European intelligence community in the absence of any such government would be purposeless. That is not, however, to say that intelligence cooperation within Europe cannot and does not take place. Now, when we look at the United Kingdom, it is fair to say that within Europe, the UK is an intelligence superpower. There are only two other European countries, France and Germany, that purport to have global intelligence reach. And I think it's fair to say, without denigrating either of them, that neither has the reach and capabilities that the UK has, which is a function of history, and in particular, as has been alluded to, the membership of the Five Eyes Anglo-Saxon Intelligence Alliance, which has shown itself over many decades to be a real force multiplier. And of course, in the event of a Brexit, the United Kingdom would remain a serious front-rank intelligence power, a member of the Five Eyes with global reach and capabilities. It would also continue to have close and growing intelligence collaboration with European counterparts. This is nothing new. It has always existed, but the character of those relationships has necessarily altered in the face of perhaps the one strategic security threat that we can identify as likely to persist for some considerable time to come, and that is, of course, transnational Islamist terrorism as currently manifested by Islamic State, but which, in the event of Islamic State being confined or diminished, is pretty likely, in most people's judgment, to manifest itself in some other form. And here I know that the British intelligence community cannot and would not dream of trying to insert itself into the public debate on Brexit. I do know that the UK intelligence community does see enormous value in the exchanges that it is possible to undertake with the with European partners, particularly in the area of exchanges of large data sets, which are key to the investigative process in dealing with a global transnational threat in which no single agency, even the mighty CIA, can have total visibility or access to all the relevant information, where, simply speaking, you cannot have too much information and you cannot predict which of your intelligence allies will turn out to have the crucial piece of the jigsaw puzzle that suddenly makes sense of a problem that presents itself to you. So, in the event of a Brexit, I do know that UK intelligence and security agencies are concerned about the institutional hiatus in these intelligence, in these data sharing arrangements that would necessarily ensue and would have to be renegotiated, presumably at a bilateral level with 27 other countries. Now, of course, the other point that has been made is that precisely the UK is an intelligence superpower. Europe is much weaker in this area. We will be fine. But the point is that intelligence and security work in this era that we now inhabit is a complex, interactive process, and there is a lot of exchange in areas of best practice where I think the United Kingdom has a lot that it can usefully share and is aspiring to share with other European partners. In the counterintelligence sphere, the extent to which all agencies and the police share a single counterterrorism agenda, a single data set, and work in concert against the threat. Also, the way in which the United Kingdom, to a degree that is far greater than is true for other European countries, has effective political oversight and control of its intelligence agencies. And that, I think, is something we've seen in Germany has been a problem with the Snowden revelations. It's become increasingly clear that Germany's political elite has not really sought to take effective ownership of its intelligence services and intelligence processes. And in the world that we now inhabit, I think there is a growing imperative for that to happen. So there are all sorts of areas in which the United Kingdom has strengths, capabilities, and best practices that from which Europe can benefit. There are a lot of myths and misapprehensions, inevitably, about how the United Kingdom can make itself more or less secure against the kind of threats that we can identify in a world characterized by growing uncertainty. Obviously, it is very difficult to identify what these threats are going to be looking ahead. But against the ones that we can confidently identify, we can't control our borders. Well, I would submit that actually, the extent to which the United Kingdom can control its borders is largely a function of the resources it is prepared to devote to doing so. It is the case that European nationals of other European countries can be excluded from the United Kingdom, in the words of the relevant Commission directive on free movement, for reasons of public policy, public security, or public health. So, if you see European nationals who you think, whose entry to the UK you judge would be detrimental to the public good, they can be prevented. Border controls, as Francois has just observed, do exist to a much greater degree than is true within the Schengen zone, where these are characterized largely by an absence. But there is a wider reality here, which is a kind of global Völkerwanderung, people movement that is taking place at the moment, which is a function of forces that are much wider than anything about Brexit or Europe. Basically, in a highly networked, globalized environment that we now inhabit, people from deprived countries now know exactly how deprived they are. They can see how much better we live than they do, and increasingly they are simply not prepared to put up with this growing disparity in living standards, and are literally taking matters into their own hands and voting with their feet. The United Kingdom is a country with, 7,000 miles of coastline, I believe? Something like that. It's pretty big anyway, and pretty hard to police. So one way or another, I suspect that immigration of some kind, difficult to manage immigration, is going to be a difficulty for us no matter what happens in relation to Brexit. So essentially, to sum up, when I looked at all of these issues, rather like Francois, in terms of first-order consequences of a Brexit, I could see nothing major that would be detrimental to UK interests, looked at from the intelligence, security, and counter-terrorism perspective. But by the same token, I could identify nothing, either big or small, by way of upside about a British departure from Europe in this regard. And then, to go back to where I started, if we look at the kind of wider implications, the longer-term second and third-order effects to which Francois referred, I think the horizon looks a lot darker. When you are a member of all the best clubs in town, that tends to give people a certain perception of who you are. Once you stop paying your membership dues to certain clubs, that too creates an impression of who you are, creates an impression, for better or worse, of an entity that is diminished. And I think that will be a global perception if we do actually end up leaving the European Union. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nigel. Thanks to all three speakers. Just one point, Nigel, that you made in your article, if I remember it correctly, is that in the collection of myths, to actually increase, and you can correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, to actually substantially increase British control over its borders as a result of Brexit, it would have to actually institute visa requirements for all European nationals, which is hard to imagine in terms of the market arrangements that presumably British economy needs. Let me just say, before I open it up to the floor, we obviously did not intentionally try to assemble a panel either on this dais or in the journal that was balanced between Brexiteers and people who argued for remaining. Having said that, I did not actually intend to. Certainly didn't seek a uniformity of view. What I saw was the analysis and the views of the best experts I could assemble. And this is what you got. Who wants to start the comments and questioning? Please identify yourself as you do. Is there a microphone? Yes. Mm-hmm. Please, right here in the front, please. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for convening this excellent panel. My name is Federico Coll, the ambassador of the Dominican Republic in London. And I think the analysis is very thought-provoking, and I come across with a number of very important lessons. I really like this framework of first order, second order. I would identify maybe a first third order effect, which is the implications of Brexit in the trade domain with third countries, non-EU members. No? The EU has assembled a network of trade agreements, and trade may seem to be not exactly strategic, but remember rationing during World War II and how part of the fabric of this nation is to ensure its food security. 65% of imports, of food imports in the UK, come from elsewhere. And all of this will be affected either by higher prices or by the need to find alternative sources of supply. And in the case of the Dominican Republic, for us, this is a growing relationship. It's the largest EU market for us, larger than Spain, than France. So all of this would be affected for the simple reason that the EU has an economic partnership agreement with Caribbean countries like mine. And by leaving the EU, the UK would have then to negotiate something with us. And some people in Parliament with whom I've discussed this, they say, well, we would welcome a free trade agreement with the Dominican Republic, no problem. And I said, well, we will join the back of your queue because you're going to be too busy renegotiating your trade relationship with the EU itself. And that is going to be traumatic for my country. But it would be traumatic for you because definitely there will be a disruption in the food supply. So that is a third order strategic effect that maybe would be worth considering in future examinations once the vote takes place. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anybody, maybe we'll collect a few and you can respond. Yes, towards the back, hands raised.
Thank you. Hi, Erica Thompson from the Australian High Commission. Thanks for a fantastic panel. It's the first event I've been to where people have teased out the issues on the strategic implications. So congratulations, IISS. Quick question to you, Nigel, about the EU cooperation that you were referring to on intelligence and CT. What is the EU instruments that you're referring to as opposed to UK-EU instruments that will no longer be accessible to the UK?
Do you want to go ahead and take that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said, there is very little that the Europe can do in this area because it is made explicitly clear in the Lisbon Treaty that issues of national security are not a European competence, to use the technical term. That being said, of course, there are institutional arrangements. A recent agreement, for example, on sharing of passenger details between European countries. That is an important facet of counterterrorism activity. There are some embryonic EU intelligence sharing arrangements. There is the European Action Services Intelligence Centre, formerly the Situation Centre, that was set up to provide the then embryonic European Action Service with some shared assessed intelligence. It's not raw intelligence. It is, it is assessed to the point where those reading it would not be aware of where the intelligence came from. There are institutions like Europol, the European Police Agency, that is playing, I think, a greater role in collecting, coordinating, sharing data and promoting best practice in the area of policing. And there is, of course, in Europe, a counter-terrorism coordinator, Gilles de Kerchove, who, although he has little in the way of power or institutional resources, can play a role in encouraging, promoting best practice and standardization of behavior. And of course, what Europe does very well, Europe may not be very significant in conventional hard power terms, but as a legislative and normative institution, Europe can be very effective in terms of the way that it can legislate in areas like financial controls, data privacy, data sharing. All of these things can create and shape a backcloth against which intelligence and security agencies function, and does have an impact on their overall competence and professionalism. So it's not that Europe can do nothing.
Francois.
Yeah, on this point, there is one element of data sharing of which the UK is not part because it is not part of Schengen, and that's the so-called Schengen Information System in its various guises, because you have several levels of information shared between various members of Schengen. That is, to my knowledge, the only instrument of pure intelligence sharing as opposed to intelligence exchange. Intelligence is usually something which you trade. In this case, it's something which everybody is supposed to put into the system and everybody is supposed to share. Does it work as well as it should? The answer is no. Does it exist? Yes. Would we be worse off if it didn't exist? The answer is yes. If Britain, like non-EU members, like Norway or Switzerland, was part of Schengen, it would be part of SIS. That's one point. On the point made by the question put by the Dominican ambassador, we have the experience of what happened when a small, comparatively small, non-EU state changed its posture vis-à-vis the EU, and that was Switzerland, when it voted by referendum 2 years ago to stop the free movement of population, much along the lines which the Leave camp here is enamored of. What has happened since then is essentially nothing. That is, the Swiss need to have a new arrangement with the EU. It would be in the interest of the EU to have an arrangement with Switzerland, but it's not happened because of the Brexit issue. There's been an eviction effect at the expense of the relationship between the EU and Switzerland, both for fear of a Swiss arrangement setting a precedent for what could eventually apply in a Brexit situation. So nobody's eager to have that precedent set on the basis of a smaller configuration like the one between Switzerland and the EU, and also simply because of systems overload. There are just so many things, a bureaucracy, even a relatively skilled and expert one as one in Brussels or in national capitals can deal with. So if you have Brexit, I suspect you would have these phenomena playing both in Brussels and in London at the expense of third parties. In trade, but not only in trade, but also in the other aspects. And I think it's an important point which the ambassador made.
And I think on the same...
Can I just come in on that as well? This issue ought to have been more important in the debate than it has been. And part of the difficulty is, one, the Leave campaign doesn't have an agreed view on it. I mean, early on in the debate, the preferred arrangement was changing every other day. So you started off with Norway and you ended up with Albania until the Albanian Prime Minister said, "You really don't want this." And anyway, we're trying to join. So we have a real difficulty. I mentioned a general problem that the Leave campaign is not a political party. Feels like one at times, but it isn't. It has very many different strands in. So we don't quite know what they want. Anyway, the decisions will be taken by Parliament. And we're not quite sure what Parliament wants. I think, we are, the Prime Minister has said, and it's all he can say, that if we vote to leave, even if it's by 0.1%, Article 50 is invoked immediately and you've got 2 years to sort it out. We can't sort this out in 2 years. We just can't. It's far too complicated. The discussion of trade negotiations shows a complete ignorance of their complexity and difficulty, the role of special interests within them, the provisos that are made. Even if, as the Leave camp insists, that everybody's going to be terribly grown up and act according to their interests, these is going to be a very difficult set of negotiations for which the UK is not prepared. I just don't think we have the capacity at the moment. We can build it up, a lot of clever people in the country, but it's going to be a real challenge. So I would not. I don't buy. You know, we vote leave and get a second referendum, a second negotiation, which is even better, because I can't believe that the EU would give us anything better, and I'm not sure what that better looks like. But I can see a situation whereby we hold off from invoking Article 50 to try to get some sort of consensus about what we're after. And I think there'll be quite a lot of people. You know, basically, I think the view in Parliament will be, as opposed to whatever people think they're voting for, that we have to keep as much of an access to the single market as possible, and that we have, if possible, to piggyback on as many of the existing agreements that we've got as possible. That's going to be very difficult, and but you could sell that, I think. And that is what I suspect the parliamentary view, whatever configuration of political parties we have after this, that's what they would try to do. But I think it'll be by far the most difficult and controversial set of issues. And many of those who voted for leave, if this happens, will feel disappointed and betrayed, possibly, by the outcome.
Sir David Omand.
David Omand, King College. Just a quick comment and a question, if I may. The comment is not to forget, in information sharing terms, that the UK, after the Paris attacks, opted in to the Prüm Convention arrangements. So that adds DNA, fingerprints, and vehicle registration access by British authorities. The question's about Northern Ireland. There was just a glancing reference from Francois. Could we have the panel's assessment of what might happen? Over the last 30 years, all attempts to close, to seal that border or strengthen that border have failed. The political situation is already fragile. Would it actually survive, the power sharing arrangements survive a Brexit?
I think that's so important that I'm going to stop right there and let everybody answer.
You want to go first?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if we look at the political configuration in Northern Ireland, it's fairly simple. You know, the Protestants tend to favour Brexit, the Republicans tend to favour Europe. So already there you have, you know, an existing fault line that potentially gets exacerbated. When it was suggested that, you know, that Brexit would have these effects on Northern Ireland, the response from the Unionists has been one of indignation that, you know, the free border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland long predates the European Union. Why should it not therefore continue? Well, you know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a constitutional expert, so I can't really offer a judgment, but I can't somehow think that it's going to be quite as simple as that. You know, the Republic of Ireland is would be part of the European Union. The United Kingdom, what's left of it, no longer would be. I think the Republic of Ireland would have to be constrained by the rules of the game as seen from within the European Union and from Brussels. What the practical implications of that would be in terms of free movement, hard to say at the moment. But I think it would certainly, in terms of the politics, it would certainly exacerbate the existing fault lines in ways that are hard to predict.
Laurie?
Well, sorry, I agree with that. There's been very little polling of Northern Ireland. I mean, I think the polls generally should all be treated with enormous caution, because I think all the pollsters are finding this very difficult and they vary enormously. I've only seen one poll from Northern Ireland which showed a very, very large majority for Remain, partly on the grounds that Nigel said. The Catholic community is very clear what it wants to do, and the Protestant community is split, actually, on the matter. So I think there will be quite a lot of disposition in Northern Ireland to try to keep things going. I think, as with always with these things, it was the same with the Scottish referendum, there's a sort of a hopeful, wishful thinking belief that all the good stuff can be sustained and only the bad stuff will go. And that's tremendously difficult in practice to manage. So I think, I've seen from the Leave campaign statements to the effect that they do not imagine a new border controls between Ireland and the north with the 6 counties. And that would cause, an attempt to put them there would cause enormous ructions within Northern Ireland, quite dangerously so. So I suspect it'll stay the same, but of course that becomes your leaky place as a result of how people come in. Just mention another place, Gibraltar. Worth keeping in mind, the Gibraltarians are petrified about leave, and even talking about possibly having to join Spain as a result. Falklanders too, very nervous about it. Not that they, or 3,000 of them, count for a lot, but you know, in British political history, they have a spot in our hearts. So these small places could again produce some of the really quite difficult and unexpected issues following a vote. Francois?
Yeah, I would tend to discount the Gibraltar, Falklands, Nouvelle-Calédonie, Azores type of arguments, because these have always been considered as sui generis cases, including for the countries which happen not to be the United Kingdom. When you go from Paris to Guadeloupe, you leave the Schengen area to enter into the non-Schengen area, and you have to display your passport. You're in the same country, but you have to display your passport with formal passport control. So these things, in practice, are not actually a problem, unless one wants to make them a problem, which is always possible. But
Spain may want to.
no, of course. No, I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen. But this is what Spain wanted to do when Britain joined the EU, and the British found a way of dealing with the Spanish challenge, and everybody at the end of the day went away, if not entirely satisfied, at least with a satisfactory modus vivendi. On Ireland, by happen chance, I spent a day in Belfast a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke with a lot of students at Queen's University, etc. I found, I didn't find a single person who was in favor of leave. Now, for what it's worth, and maybe happen chance made it that I only spoke with Catholics, but I don't know that. And of course, the university itself, I think.
Couldn't you tell?
No, it actually no. It's all strange. You're supposed to be able to tell actually over there, but I didn't have the antenna. But Belfast overall, there seemed to be absolutely no propaganda whatsoever, one way or the other. The propaganda you see continues to be the old-style propaganda, and are largely for the tourists, by the way, so that you can take photographs of the Bobby Sands and the white hand or the red hand or whatever the color is, white hand, that sort of stuff. This was clearly a place which, to the casual visitor, was not excited about the notion of having a referendum on something which it may have been taken for granted. David Omand on Prüm, absolutely right. This is quite important, by the way, because this is the deepest level of sharing. I don't know whether the Leave campaigners here have a view on whether whether a non-EU United Kingdom would remain part of that extraordinarily tightly integrated intelligence sharing.
Okay, since we're starting to run out of time, and as usually happens, that's when all the hands come up, I'm going to take a cluster of as many as I can. So ask our panelists to write down and respond judiciously. I think the gentleman here in the third row caught my eye a while ago.
William Horsley, independent journalist. One important element I don't think you've touched on is the whole Justice and Home Affairs cooperation, which of course includes the arrest warrant issue. If I understand, I mean, our Home Secretary was swayed. She's not a natural leave personally, but I think that probably swayed her. So perhaps say something about the impact of losing that or trying to renegotiate it. The point, it seems to me, about the UK being absent from the table at these very regular events. I mean, hundreds of events every month in Brussels, in the General Affairs Council, foreign ministers' meetings. They discuss Kosovo problems. They discuss renewal of sanctions on Russia. Surely that in itself relegates the UK very visibly to a backseat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a gentleman.
The question has been asked.
Okay, thanks. Okay, in the front row.
Eva Lennon, Finnish Broadcasting. What do you think if Britain leaves EU, is the dream about, or the idea about EU having its own defence in any way completely shattered, or will it be easier to do it?
Thank you. Okay, and in the third row in the middle, right here. Keep scribbling.
Michael Arthur, former diplomat. Not a question, but just on that Northern Ireland exchange, you framed your answers in terms of free movement of people, but don't forget you're going to have one agricultural economy outside the CAP and one inside the CAP, and that in itself is going to impose some border controls.
Yep.
And directly behind him.
Dominic Wag on Sky News. Can I just ask you, you weren't asked to look into this, but what are the strategic implications you think of a Remain vote of the European Union staying together? And what do you make of Brexit, sort of worst case scenario predictions of a structural imbalance, Eurozone collapsing, Greece or another country having to drop out, or conversely a too inflexible, brittle, centralised federal Europe, and what that could lead to in the future, sort of long term, so we can put it in perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to have a chance to answer all of that, but
That's a good question.
No, it is.
and I'm going to take one more or even two more, but I don't see them.
Yep.
Richard Norton Taylor.
Richard Norton at The Guardian. Excellent collection of essays, but point about pragmatic intelligence sharing and cooperation. The Defence Secretary here has made robust comments about the importance of staying in the EU, but the Home Secretary has not. He's kept quite mum on this. I just wondered if you can have an observation.
Okay, and one last question right here. Yes. My apologies to those I haven't been able to take, but.
My name is Mimi Layton. I go to Harvard University. And my question is about nuclear security. So, as I understand it, you have Euratom that governs civilian nuclear facilities, and I was wondering what Brexit would mean for the UK's participation in that, and also, of course, with nuclear weapons.
Okay, again, apologies that I wasn't able to call on everyone. Why don't we go in reverse order, if that's okay, and just pick and choose whatever you can do in 2 minutes. Okay. Three at a stretch.
So me first, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, well, European defence, is that is that a vision that is sustainable or not? Why I think that depends on the perception of willingness of European nations to move more in that direction, and raises questions about what that means in relation to NATO. I mean, I think if it is seen, and there is a case for arguing that maybe NATO, a NATO that is excessively reliant on a United States that could be heading in a more isolationist direction, indeed holds water, then maybe the case for a greater initiative by Europe on defence matters would make sense. But that is going to be driven not, I think, by Brexit, but by this wider perception of the value of existing institutions and the need for others.
But when the English armies leave,
Yes.
if it's get out.
Yeah. But you can always grow an army. All you need to do is decide that you're going to, and devote the resources that are required. on the question of the engagement on, is it third pillar, home affairs and justice, yes, I couldn't agree more that the United Kingdom benefits from this. I mean, it's been said, for example, in the counter-terrorism context, that the European arrest warrant is of no value. But I remember very, very vividly from personal experience that in the wake of the failed second London bombings on the 24th of July 2004, one of the perpetrators escaped and made his way to either Spain or Italy, I can't remember which, Rome, that's right, yeah. Well, we had him back within about 72 hours thanks to the European arrest warrant. So, an institution like that, I think, shows its value. And I think in terms of intelligence sharing, I would be very surprised if the Home Secretary was not at least as staunch a supporter of the existing arrangements as any other member of the Cabinet.
Quickly, first, the UK, either of its own volition or simply because of the eviction effect that the referendum campaign has been having on your ability to focus on other issues in the world, has already sidelined itself quite substantially on a host of issues. Britain, to my knowledge, is nowhere to be seen on Ukraine-Russia. You are not part of the Normandy format. You are not interested. You are not there. You are no longer in the Douglas Hurd's position of punching above your weight. You're probably doing a bit less of that, and that actually has little to do at this stage with belonging or not belonging to the EU. Simply, that is the situation. Whether a Remain vote will allow you to climb back into that position, I do not know. I mentioned the uncertainties flowing from a Remain vote. If you have a Leave vote, you're probably not going to get any favors from the Germans or the French in terms of being part of the inner circle on issues of that sort. Defense. ESDP, CSDP has been in the doldrums for half a decade. Britain in practice has not really been there for more than 10 years now. And however much people in Germany or Mr. Juncker, my Luxembourgeois semi-compatriot, may talk about the European army, the fact of the matter is that there is nothing of the sort to be seen on the horizon, even the distant horizon. Brexit will make it even more difficult, not because you can't grow an army. Of course, yes, you can grow an army, and on this Nigel is absolutely right. If the Germans decide that they and the French together are going to make up for the fact that the British have gone AWOL, they could, but simply because of the divisive effect which the British departure would have overall on the EU debate in our country's federalism. To come back to another question, federalism, although it is a theoretical possibility and sometimes mentioned as a political possibility, for that reason is not going to happen, and it's not going to happen in the defense realm more than anywhere else. A word on Home Secretaries in a more general manner. I can't comment on your own. Home Secretaries don't tend to like the intrusion of multilateral institutions in their bailiwick. And this is true in Germany and France, as it has been in other countries. In the Schengen area, the best defenders of Schengen are outside of the home ministries, simply because it disrupts the normal mode of operation. And when something extraordinary happens of the sort which Nigel mentioned, it was the recovery in 2005 of one of the would-be bombers. The Italians restored it. It was actually less than 72 hours. It was absolutely phenomenal. Yep. This is seen more or less as a normal course. This is, oh yeah, well yeah, sure. Whereas, of course, the French will remember that it took them 10 years to secure the extradition of the guy who masterminded the metro bombings in Paris in 1995, 10 years to get him back from the United Kingdom. Conservatism in the sociological sense is strongly rooted in our home ministries. So no surprise there.
Okay.
It's not judicial.
So,
And our judiciary.
I agree with what's been said. Let me just take up this question of what happens if Remain wins, which probably still just about most likely. Well, I don't think we're going to have sort of an Ottoman invasion or be forced into a Euro army. Or that. I mean, it's been again, the review, as I tried to suggest at the start, a complete lack of understanding of where the rest of Europe is on these issues. I think one of the distressing things about the debate is the utter ignorance of broader European politics and the variety of opinions within Europe about security and immigration and so on. So they're not the problems. The problem, secondly, I think one has to, it isn't only because we've been lukewarm to the EU. Britain has been through a decade of difficulty in trying to work out what it wants out of its foreign policy because of Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, the lingering effects of those are as important, and we will see maybe from the Syrian vote at the end of last year, whether there's a turnaround from that. But these also have had their effects. I don't think it's wholly fair to say that we've been absent on the Ukraine issue. I think on the NATO side and on the sanctions side, the UK has played a role, and the Normandy format was never going to be one in which we were likely to play a role. But I think there will be a readiness to get more engaged because of those are the sort of issues actually which British Prime Ministers tend to relish as opposed to some of the more fiddly ones. I think the real challenges to the EU actually are not because of Britain. There's the risk of a Grexit, it still seems to be pretty large. The question of German banking. I mean, there's all sorts of issues coming up which could put real stress and strain on the organisation. I think what we've seen over the last few years is a demonstration of the will within the core political class of Europe to hold the whole thing together. And we've never been quite thinking about it in the same way. But the challenges are enormous. And that's why I started my observations by noting that whether in or out, we're affected by all of that. And if events conspire against the EU, possibly because of another banking crisis, possibly because of more terrorism or migration issues or whatever, then or simply because other nations, whatever we do, decide to hold their own referendums or start to be awkward in their attitudes, the institution is going to be in difficulty. That is why I think, again, the options for us are not, as one sees in so many tweets and sound bites these days. So either we commit ourselves to a greater and more federal Europe, or else we stride out on our own. It's going to be something quite messy either way.
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize the general debate on this issue, but if I may say so myself, I think what we've heard this morning has been at the very high end in terms of informative and serious analysis. And I think it's been very high in absolute terms as well. So I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists who made this possible.
10 days and counting.
10 days and counting, yeah.
God, what a mess. The word clusterfuck doesn't begin to. Makes Trump look smart. I think what I was saying is there was just something about human nature